Hi, it's Dr. Robert Psychiatry. Thanks for tuning in to a new episode of the Doctor Podcast Show. We're going to have a great episode today, so please click on the follow and subscribe button. We'd really appreciate it. We are this close to getting as many followers as Joe Rogan, and with your help, I think we can beat him on this show, so I'd really appreciate it. And if you like this episode, which I'm sure you will, please click on the like button and also on the repost button and send us as many comments as you'd like. We'd really appreciate that. So today I have a great guest, Dr. Kerry Sulkowicz. Dr. Sulkowicz is a psychiatrist. He's a clinical professor of psychiatry at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine and the NYU Langone Medical Center here in New York City. Dr. Sulkowicz is also a psychoanalyst, which we'll get into to explain what that is. He's the past president of the American Psychoanalytic Association, very prominent and prestigious organization. And he's also the founding and managing principal of the Boswell Group, which is his company. The Boswell Group does many things related to medicine and consulting and psychiatry as well. It's a management consultancy based in New York, and he started in 1998, many years ago. He advises some of the world's top executives and CEOs and presidents and chairmen of many major corporations in the USA and around the world regarding issues such as leadership challenges, CEO succession, management team, board dynamics, which gets very touchy and difficult, I'm sure, merger and acquisition integration, high-stakes hiring assessments, and also corporate culture change, which is a major issue these days, the way the world is evolving rapidly. Did I get that all right, Dr. Sulkowicz?
I think you got it all right, and maybe I shouldn't say anything further, Robert. It's really nice to be here with you.
Oh, thanks very much for coming and taking time from your busy schedule. So tell us about your background, how you got interested in psychiatry and why you became a psychiatrist.
Sure. It's a question that when you ask that of a psychiatrist, you have to kind of go back to childhood in some ways.
Well, we have today's show is going for 3 hours. So.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah,
well,
not a problem.
I'm hoping to help you with Joe Rogan and surpassing him there. It's true, though. I think a lot of our choices of careers do have roots in some of our early life experiences, good ones and bad ones. For me, my family background was profoundly influential to me. My parents, who are sadly no longer with us, were both Holocaust survivors from Poland, who miraculously survived concentration camps and immigrated to the United States. And that's always a complicated kind of experience. It casts a long shadow. For me, though, one of the consequences of that was that as a kid, I've always been a big reader, but as a kid, one of the things that I found myself reading a lot were biographies of leaders. I'm not talking about business leaders, I was talking about world leaders, Churchill and Gandhi and Martin Luther King and so on. And it was only years later, in retrospect, that I understood why I was so interested in reading biographies of leaders, which was that I was really profoundly curious, really on an emotional basis, not an intellectual one back then, to understand how did leaders get large groups of people to do good things and especially to get them to do bad things.
Right.
So that interest in leadership and understanding the relationship between leaders and the led really has informed my life's work.
That's a great analysis there, especially the part about how they get them to do bad things.
Yeah, I mean, that was really an abiding interest of mine, and it has morphed in various ways and informs my work today.
Wow. And then you became a psychoanalyst as well, in addition to a psychiatrist. Can you tell us what that means, becoming
Sure.
a psychoanalyst, and how many years and how much time and extra work that takes?
Well, becoming a psychiatrist, as you know, of course, is one of many specialties in medicine. So I went to college, medical school, and then came to New York, where I've been anchored in many ways ever since, and did a residency in psychiatry at NYU and Bellevue Hospital. But in my much earlier, when I was in college, I studied English literature at Harvard, and was really inspired by a few professors who took a psychoanalytic literary criticism perspective on the teaching of great works of literature, particularly Shakespeare's tragedies in my case.
Really?
And I had no idea what psychoanalysis meant.
Right.
Everybody has sort of heard of Freud. He's such a figure in the popular consciousness, but it didn't mean that much to me. But this professor that I had in college really brought these characters to life in a much deeper way, trying to understand and explain not only their surface behavior, but their underlying motivations and the influence of their past on their present. And that was really intriguing to me, and certainly had some personal resonance in terms of my own experience that I was just alluding to a moment ago. And so I started reading on my own, and then took a class in psychology where I was exposed to different approaches to understanding personality development and human development. And so when I went to medical school, I already had this idea of wanting to not only be a psychiatrist but also to be a psychoanalyst. So to answer your question, in general, to become a psychoanalyst, and I'll try to define it in a moment, one needs some basic training in one of the more traditional mental health disciplines, typically either psychiatry or psychology, and increasingly social workers as well. And then once one completes the highest level of training in those basic specialties, one can go on to study psychoanalysis, which is essentially part-time training. It's not full-time like residency, but it's quite lengthy, usually somewhere 5 to 7 years.
Wow.
It's a long time, but
Long time.
one can practice and work and have a job and so on while training to become a psychoanalyst. I was very lucky because at NYU they had a rather innovative program that allowed me to start my psychoanalytic training at they have an institute there for psychoanalysis called the Psychoanalytic Association of New York, PANI. And I was able to start my psychoanalytic training somewhat concurrently with the second half of my residency. So I finished my residency in 1989 and graduated from psychoanalytic training in 1992. But I was already practicing when I graduated from analytic training. And psychoanalysis is it's both a theory of mind, but it's also describes a range of methodologies of treatment, generally thought of as a spectrum from psychoanalysis, which is by far the most intensive form of psychotherapy, to other less intensive forms of psychotherapy that are informed by psychoanalysis.
I see. And so my understanding is you have to be psychoanalyzed by another psychiatrist or
By another
psychoanalyst, right, for several years, that you can understand yourself better.
Yeah, that's an essential part of the training. There are really 3 parts to psychoanalytic training. There's the classroom part, which is typically about 4 years. There's supervised treatment of other patients, and then there's one's own so-called personal psychoanalysis, which is a private matter. It's not, but it's often done concurrently with the other parts of training, because the training itself stirs up a lot, and it's helpful to have some understanding of one's own mind, what makes one tick, while you're trying to do that for others.
For other patients. That's very interesting. Yeah. Interesting you mentioned Shakespeare. I'm thinking about that as you said it. Shakespeare was probably the first psychoanalyst, and he actually put it into his plays.
Well, I'm not sure about first, but I've always thought that some of the great writers throughout history, Shakespeare, of course, being one of the greatest ever, had far more profound insights into a lot of aspects of human nature than people in psychiatry and psychoanalysis did, and Freud himself, who was really the father of psychoanalysis. And he was experimenting, but he drew on literature a lot, and his work itself was highly literary, won the Goethe Prize for literature.
Interesting. Now, you started as a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, seeing patients, and then you became interested in leadership consulting and organizational consulting. How did that evolve into that?
Yeah, it's a bit of a zigzag path. I wish I could tell you, Robert, that I had this brilliant plan to, become a consultant to CEOs, but I don't want to lie to you. That would not be the case. I'll tell you, the really honest answer to that is I did have this interest in leadership that I was mentioning before, going back to when I was a kid, really. I'd also gravitated to taking on certain leadership roles myself. you know, editor of the high school newspaper, captain of the fencing team, and
Fencing
I
team?
was a fencing, yeah,
Really?
and very, you know, so I always found myself in leadership roles, and I enjoyed that, and I was interested in it, and I was always trying to be a good leader, even though that's hard to define. Maybe we can talk about that later, but. But when I was in full-time private practice after I finished my training, the practice was going well. It was thriving, not too far from your office in New York. But in one of those, I suppose, treasured moments in between patients, when usually, you know, you have 5 minutes to answer a phone call or go to the bathroom or something, but
Right.
occasionally it's a good idea to use those minutes to think. And I remember thinking to myself, is this how I want to spend the rest of my professional life? I was in my 30s, and the answer that kind of came back in my head was actually kind of disturbing, which is I'm not so sure. And so I tried to interrogate that thought, and
So you started psychoanalyzing yourself.
exactly, which is a useful thing to try to be able to do. We're never perfectly good at that. We always have our blind spots.
Right.
But I realized that there were some things that I really liked about being in clinical practice. I like helping people. I still very much like doing that. I like the intellectual underpinnings of it. What wasn't a good fit for my temperament, when I was honest with myself, my temperament, I was a little too restless to be sitting in an office all day seeing one patient after another, and I liked getting out in the world more. I have nothing but admiration for people who spend all day seeing patients, doing psychotherapy. But it just wasn't a good fit for me, and I found it emotionally depleting. And what I did like, though, I liked getting out of my office and teaching. I liked traveling. I liked being out in the world more. I didn't quite know what to do with that. This interest in leadership was rumbling around in my mind until a transformative, serendipitous conversation at a cocktail party.
Really?
Yeah, I was at a cocktail party, and I was. And one of the occupational hazards of being a shrink at a cocktail party is that people have a glass of wine or two, and then they, you know, unburden themselves. And
There you go, psychoanalysis.
yeah, I've always
again.
enjoyed that, you know, because I really do like listening to people's stories. And so I was talking to a guy at a cocktail party. We were both having a glass of wine, and I was mainly listening to him. And he told me that he was a CEO. He and two friends had left a big advertising agency to start a startup here in New York, and he just kept talking, and he was saying that he was challenged. And just because you have the CEO title doesn't mean you know how to inhabit the role. And so he was a first-time CEO and struggling to figure out exactly what to do with that. He and these two friends had started a business, but he had become the CEO, which meant that they hadn't, and so it had changed the dynamics of their partnership.
Right.
And the company had gotten seed funding from a company from a different country, and there were cultural tensions. Anyway, it was all very interesting to me, and I listened to him, and I made a few comments, and after a little while, he said, this was a conversation that really changed my life. He said, Kerry, you know, it's been really interesting talking to you. I've found some of the things that you've said helpful because they've gotten me to think about my role as a CEO in a different sort of way. He said, when would you be able to start consulting to me? Maybe we could meet every couple of weeks. And I'm going to give you this slightly edited version because I've become a bit more tactful over time. And I said to him, look, you know, you seem like a nice guy. It's been really interesting talking to you, but I think you're out of your mind because you obviously need help. And, you know, you should probably go hire somebody who does that for a living, helps CEOs.
Right.
And then he said something that really was the light bulb moment. He said, you know, the fact that you've just told a CEO who you've known for half an hour that you think he's out of his mind, and you're a psychiatrist no less, you know, that makes me want to hire you even more because one of the problems I have as a CEO is that nobody talks straight to me anymore. Everybody tells me how smart and good looking I am and all that sort of thing. I don't need to hear that. I need to hear the unvarnished truth. And I thought, maybe there's something here.
Right.
And I should have mentioned, I had actually started a startup a couple of years before myself, which was a complete failure. It was a complete failure.
That's how you learn.
It is how you learn. It was a great experience, even though it didn't work. And the generous way of looking at it is that it was what today might be called one of these online mental health companies. But anyway, it didn't work. But I really liked it. I learned a lot, as you just said. And it kind of whetted my appetite for doing something entrepreneurial. It was a part of myself that I was discovering, really. So when I had that cocktail party conversation and he asked me if I could advise him, and then he persisted, as good CEOs do, even though I told him he should go hire somebody else. That was the beginning, and one thing led to another, and there's more to the story, but that's really how it got started.
Interesting how one little event, a few minutes, can trigger a total change in direction.
I'm a big believer in being open to pursuing serendipity.
Right. Yeah, you have to be aware of it, though. Sometimes serendipity can hit you, but you overlook it and don't understand what the ramifications are and how it can evolve into other things and better things. That got you started with, when did you create the Boswell Group after that?
So that conversation was
company, right?
Yeah. So that conversation was in around 1996. He was kind enough to refer me to a couple of other CEOs of startups. This is in the early days of the internet bubble, the first one, back in the 90s. And so I'd seen a sum total of 3 CEOs in internet companies. And
they needed a lot of help.
They needed a lot of help, and it was super interesting to me. And then I did what any self-respecting academic does. You see something 3 times, you declare yourself an expert, and then you write a paper. So I did that. I wrote a paper. It was actually called Psychoanalysis and the New Economy. And I've done a lot of writing, and I write partly to get these ideas out, but frankly, I write selfishly to help me organize my thinking.
Writing does help you organize your thinking. It's interesting. I've written some things, and as I'm writing, new ideas come into my head from that.
It's exactly the experience I had.
Right.
So I've always liked to write, and so I wrote this paper, and I was giving it at Department of Psychiatry grand rounds down at the old St. Vincent's Hospital, which no longer exists. It's now a expensive condominium in the West Village,
like most hospitals.
Like most hospitals. And so I gave this paper, and a reporter from the New York Times was there. She came up to me afterwards, and she said, look, Dr. Sulkowicz, I'm not going to cover your paper because it's boring and academic. She said, but could I call you sometimes, because you seem to think about the psychology of leadership. Right. Could I use you as a resource at some point? And so she did, and she wrote a little thing about me, which was a total puff piece. I couldn't have asked for better publicity. And then somebody helped me rewrite this boring academic paper into an article that was published on the cover of an internet business magazine that's long gone, called The Industry Standard. And those 2 things really launched this new part of my career, which I originally thought was going to be a hobby on the side of my clinical practice. Right. And then it was a couple of years later, in 1998, that I started the Boswell Group.
Wow, that's amazing. That reminds me of what I'm doing now. I started doing this as sort of a fun type hobby, and now Joe Rogan is getting nervous about me. So,
be careful, Joe Rogan.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
No, this is an entrepreneurial venture of yours.
Yeah, I'm enjoying this. It's great. Having a lot of fun with it. So how did you pick the Boswell Group? Do you want to tell us that?
Sure. Well, it's a funny story. So I wanted to, somebody had given me some advice. I take advice, I listen to advice, I should say, from lots of people. I don't always do what they tell me, but I do listen. And somebody said, since you're serious about this consulting thing, you should start a consultancy to establish an identity that's separate from your clinical practice, which was still, going strong full time. And that seemed like a good idea. So I thought, what do I call this thing? And my first name, Kerry, people don't know if I'm a boy or a girl. My last name, Sulkowicz, too hard to spell and pronounce. It's too complicated. So I had a dog at the time named Boswell.
There you go. And he suggested it to you.
Well, he was a great partner. He was my first partner. But after about a year, I kind of realized, I talked to my dog all the time, but he didn't have much to say in return, and I thought some human colleagues would be helpful. And so actually one of my former psychotherapy supervisors at Bellevue, who had an interest in family business. He'd come from a family business himself. He and 2 other, another psychiatrist and a psychologist, all 3 of them were trained as psychoanalysts. I took them out to dinner and I said, hey, you want to join the Boswell Group? And they looked at me like, what is that? And I said, well, I honestly don't really know what it is, but I'm trying to, first of all, I'm a little lonely and I need some colleagues to talk about this with, and all of you are interested in applications of psychoanalytic thinking to leadership and to organizations. And so that was really the birth of the group.
Wow, that's amazing. How do business leaders reach out to you now and find you? Like if Elon Musk, who's got a lot of stuff going on, says, I could really use some help with my company and my board and investors and all my businesses, how does he find you?
Yeah. It's I appreciate that question. It has changed over the years considerably. I've been doing this for a long time. We celebrated the 25th anniversary of the Boswell Group last year.
That's great.
So I've been doing it for nearly 30 years. In the early days, the first several years of my practice, frankly, I got a lot of referrals from psychiatrists who were treating senior executives in organizations.
Right.
And people, of course, in psychotherapy would talk, among other things, about their challenges in work. And a lot of these were senior executives, and so that's how I got some early referrals. I certainly did a fair amount of self-promotion, I suppose. The writing led. I was a columnist for 3 years each in 2 different business magazines, and one called Fast Company, another called Business Week, and so I wrote about 6 years worth of columns on the psychology of business. And I've always liked, kind of an offshoot of my teaching, I've always liked public speaking and sort of talking about these issues in public. So that was a way of generating interest in the work. And I think over the last 10 or 15 years, the bottom line is I've been incredibly fortunate and lucky, and I've developed a bit of a reputation. And so now I'd say most of my referrals come from CEOs that I work with, current or former clients of mine, as well as members of boards. Directors of companies often are senior in the business world and sit on multiple boards, and they're often in a position to recommend me. But the other thing that has worked, that frankly has been so lucky, is that sometimes people refer to what I do as coaching, executive coaching, and the coaching phenomenon was just really getting started. It was in its infancy back in the 90s, and back in those days it was relegated largely to executives who were in some kind of deep trouble, and usually it was behavioral.
Right.
And then they'd get a coach for some period of months, and if the coach didn't fix them, then basically they got sacked. Fortunately for the business world, but also fortunately for me and my colleagues who do this kind of work, the culture around coaching has changed dramatically. So it went from being just for people in trouble to now there's a lot of CEOs couldn't imagine being without a coach. And a lot of venture capitalists, for instance, will insist on the CEOs in their portfolio companies having coaches. So in a sense, that has kind of tracked the parallel destigmatization of psychotherapy in society, where it used to be something that was largely shameful,
right,
to now something that people are much more open about.
Interesting. So you mentioned you started yourself, and then you added a few colleagues. So how big an organization is the Boswell Group now?
It's still small. We're 13 people.
Right.
Sadly, the first one of the first ones, who was my former supervisor, just passed away last summer. So that was a really sad loss. But for the last number of years, we've been around 13 to 15 people. We've kept it small. We don't have aspirations to become some big consulting firm with multiple layers of associates and that sort of thing.
Right.
We each love doing the work. Now there's 13 people. Each of us has a largely autonomous practice under the umbrella of the group, and people develop their own cases, although we refer a lot of work to each other as well. But the group serves other purposes for ourselves, and for me, perhaps the most important one is not the commercial side of it, but the opportunity to get together. We have actually 3 retreats a year where we spend a full day together. We have one coming up later this week, in fact, where we'll spend a day together and talk about the kind of issues that we're seeing coming up in our work. And it's it's as much a peer support group, if you will, as it is as an enterprise.
Right. Plus, you see what's going on in the corporate world and apply that to future or even present clients.
It's an opportunity for continuing education and learning.
So are you just in New York or all of the USA, the world? Where are you these days?
Well, a little bit all over the place. I I actually divide my time between London and New York. London has become, over the last 5 years or so, my primary home. I spend about 3/4 of my time living in London and have a place there and a place here in New York. My practice is not divided exactly in the same way. I do have clients in London, but most of my clients are still U.S. based, and so I do a fair amount of traveling. I'm on the board of a private equity firm based in Singapore called Asia Partners.
Singapore.
Yeah, I'll be there in a couple of weeks.
You're flying around a lot.
I am. I probably did more pandemic-related travel than a lot of people, but I've always had a bit of an adventurous side, and I like seeing the world.
That's great. So what do these corporate heads and leaders and CEOs and presidents, chairmen, what do they call you for? What kind of help do they need that you can
Sure.
help them out with?
Well, there are one or two irreducible facts about being in the top leadership position in an organization that, in a sense, keep me in business. One is, it's such a truism that the idea of it's lonely at the top, and it turns out that is really accurate. That there is an inherent degree of isolation to anyone in the senior leadership role, the CEO, the president, whatever the title may be, and it's understandable. That's the nature of organizations, but what that means is that the person at the top of an organization often can't talk about certain things to people within the organization itself because of the nature of power dynamics being inhibiting. You may not want to open up so fully to somebody who reports to you.
Right.
So one is simply the need to talk to somebody. It's a natural human need that goes back presumably to the dawn of time, which is the need for a confidant. It certainly doesn't have to be me, but that's a natural human need, is to have someone who you can confide in about the most sensitive things. And then secondly, the idea of bringing a psychologically informed perspective to bear on some of the challenges of leadership. Leadership is inherently psychological. It's more than that too, but it's the understanding the dynamics, and these are the things that people want to talk about. They want to talk about the dynamics of their boardroom or of their management team, their own anxieties and stressors as they contemplate difficult decisions on a daily basis that are filled with ambiguity and uncertainty. No 2 days are alike for a leader of an organization, and they're often in a position of making really hard decisions based on inevitably incomplete information. And so that is stressful. And so I serve as a sounding board on people, culture, team dynamics, boardroom issues, leadership transitions in organizations, succession. Culture is a big focus. So it's the soft stuff.
So very difficult things that you're dealing with. Now, everybody has their own issues that they have at home with their spouses or families or friends or neighbors, and I'm sure they bring that into their business and into the boardroom. Do you have to do a psychological or psychiatric evaluation or a mini psychoanalysis of these people to make sure that they're not being overly influenced by matters unrelated to the business?
It's a really interesting issue, and I have a few thoughts on that. One is, I'm not treating anybody as my patient so this is a consulting relationship, not a clinical one. On the other hand, it would be silly to suggest that my clinical perspective doesn't inform a lot of what I do, and it does. So I'm certainly thinking about the person's life, their history, their psychology, how their mind works, and all of us, as you said, you're absolutely right, all of us have something.
Right.
All of us have a past. All of us have had difficult times in one way or another. Nobody sails through life unscathed. And we're also unitary people in the sense that our personal lives and our work lives, it's impossible to completely segregate those. They're intimately intertwined. And so what's happening in one's business life affects one's personal life and vice versa. And so those things naturally enter into the work that I do.
Right, so you have to evaluate that as well. Can you share some examples of things you've done in companies without obviously revealing, the exact people and identities?
Yeah. Um, I'm thinking about some of the things that have been coming up in recent times. I've been doing this for a long time.
Right. Recent times have been very turbulent.
They have. This is a particularly difficult time to be a leader. It's always hard to be a leader in many ways, to really do it right. But I think there's some additional challenges which I'm happy to go into. But the kinds of things that come up frequently in my work, for instance, are a CEO who is trying to get his or her leadership team to perform at a high level, and sometimes it's because the challenge to that is because they don't have the right people around the table. There may be some sort of weak links, if you will, people who aren't either at the right level of skill, or people who, by virtue of their personalities and behavior, are disruptive to the smoother, more productive functioning of the team. And so we spend a lot of time talking about the people on the team, and I actually have a chance to meet them as well. So not that I don't take the CEO's word for it when they describe it, but it's important for me to understand those people.
Unbiased view.
Well, it's a combination of trying to be unbiased, but it's also there's always at least two sides to every story, and so one person's account of the problem, which I'm assuming is almost always the truth, it's just not the whole truth, and a lot of the dynamic tensions that occur on leadership teams are a two to tango kind of situation, and sometimes, in fact, the CEO may be inadvertently contributing to it by virtue of their behavior. And so we try to unpack that. Sometimes it results in a meeting between those two people that I facilitate to enable them to sort out some differences that haven't been resolved. Sometimes it involves some coaching to change the behavior of one or the other person or both. Sometimes, and it's not as frequent, but in some cases it involves the person who's problematic leaving the company, because I think one of the things about a psychoanalytic perspective that I think is helpful in applying in this kind of work is what I would describe as a perspective of cold realism about the nature of human personality. There are some aspects of our personalities, our behaviors, that really are amenable to change. Based on coaching and encouraging people to try things, or helping them understand what might be blocking them from expanding their behavioral repertoire. But in other cases, it would be like saying, listen, Robert, you'd be a much better ophthalmologist if you were a foot taller. I mean, you would look at me like, that's not happening.
Right.
So in other words, there's some things that are so deeply ingrained that they're not changeable.
Right. So what happens if you meet with the CEO of a major company, Fortune 500 company, which you're dealing with, and they tell you all their problems and issues with the board and this and that's wrong and what should I do? And after you speak with them for a while, talk to the members of the board, you realize that the CEO is the problem and everybody else is functioning properly and accordingly. How do you deal with that? This person hired you to help straighten out the company or some problem, and it turns out they are the problem, but they're the head of the company.
Yeah, that does happen. It certainly it does happen. It's certainly the exception rather than the rule. In part, I would point out that there's a fair degree of self-selection in terms of the kinds of CEOs who would want to hire somebody like me. It tends to be CEOs who have at least a modicum of self-awareness, who have enough humility to know that they don't know all the answers. One of the worst traits in leaders, or in people in general, frankly, but certainly in leaders, is something that I've described as pathological certainty.
I like that.
The kind of leader who's got every answer. What could you possibly tell me that I don't already know? And
that's
of course,
awesome. Pathological certainty.
Yeah, it's really dangerous in a leader. It's really dangerous in a leader.
Tough for you to break into and tell them things aren't.
But those kinds of CEOs don't want to hire somebody like me. I actually tend to meet them, to the extent that I ever do, when I'm hired by a board to help a board with a CEO succession process, and they're getting fired because those personality traits have essentially contributed to their failure. Because you're dealing with a lot of narcissism in those cases, and that can be rather malignant. But in any event, when there are problems, my assumption is that everybody is responsible in some ways. When a group, a management team, or a board is dysfunctional, my a priori assumption is that everyone is contributing to that problem in some way or another, some more, some less. But nobody is really a bystander. In the rare situation where the CEO is really problematic, this actually touches on another difference between doing psychotherapy and doing consulting in this way. Excuse me. Psychotherapy is a one-on-one relationship, a private, confidential relationship, and the client, so to speak, in psychotherapy is the patient. There's no ambiguity there.
Right.
In doing consulting work, and this is more than a semantic point, the client is never the CEO alone. The client is the organization. And the reason why I say that's an important or a meaningful point is that it, first of all, I do try to always think what is in the best interest not only of the CEO but really of the organization as a whole, which is related to the question that you're asking. And so having this perspective of the organization being the client also positions me to have contact with the board of directors, with other members of the management team, and it's just happened a few times in life where in my career, I should say, in my life, where I've had the opportunity to speak to a board about a problematic CEO and then help them facilitate a CEO succession process. But it's very rare.
It's interesting. Now, let's say a CEO hires you for some help. Does that information become public to the board? In other words, does the board know what your discussions with the CEO are?
Really important question. No is the answer.
No.
I take confidentiality really seriously.
You have to.
Yeah. Not only does it come from psychiatric and psychoanalytic ethics, but it's absolutely essential to ensure the people that I'm talking to of strict confidentiality. Otherwise, they're going to be reluctant to open up to me about the things that are most important to talk about. So no, I'm not going to go, run to the board and say, "Can you believe the CEO just said that?" I would never do that.
Okay.
I will, for instance, sometimes I will do what's referred to as a 360-degree evaluation of a CEO, but I do that with the full knowledge of the CEO at the request of the CEO and the board, and I present my findings directly to the CEO first, not to the board, so that the CEO is fully aware of what I'm going to say. So it's all above board and with agreed upon transparency internally. Vis-a-vis the external world, of course, it's totally confidential.
Right. Now, if a CEO hires you, and then let's say somebody else on the board wants to hire you, would that be a conflict of interest then?
Well, you have to evaluate these things on a case-by-case basis. It really depends on the nature of the relationships or what somebody on the board is doing. So there are a set of considerations that you have to take into account. But it's a version of do no harm. If there is a conflict, it's better to err on the side of caution.
Does this ever happen? You've done a great job for the CEO. Very grateful, happy. Things are running much smoother, and Kerry, I need to talk to you about my wife. I'm having a lot of problems with her. Can you help me out with that? What happens when that occurs?
That happens fairly often. Yeah, the relationship typically.
I thought so.
Or
I should say, or my husband. I don't know.
Whatever.
Right. Okay.
Or my kids.
Or
or my cousin, or whoever it may be.
Right, or my daughter who wants to take over the company, but I don't think she's suitable. So what happens when that occurs?
I welcome it, frankly. It's part of their life. It's part of what's affecting how they are. In some situations, we will certainly spend time talking about that, or sometimes I'll even meet members of their family. If it looks like it's a situation that may require much more concerted time, or even perhaps a referral for psychotherapy treatment for the member of the family, then I'll make a referral. I won't take that on. But in terms of coming up in our conversations, it's more than fair game because it's obviously something that's bothering them, concerning them.
Now, what happens if there's a conflict between the board and the CEO and you're not getting anywhere? People don't change their behavior or their patterns. Do you at some point say, I can't help you, and that's that? Or do you continue to attempt to try to help out?
Well, I always try to continue to help out to the extent that I can, but I can't help every situation. Sometimes complicated dynamics, and the thing that what you were just citing is one of many permutations of complexity that come up in this kind of work. One of the things that's important for people who do what I do to assess is first to understand the complexity of the problem itself, and that takes time. And then to understand, is the kind of work we're doing something that can actually have an impact on that problem? Because certainly what I'm focusing on is the acquisition of insight and then applying that insight in the form of perhaps behavioral changes that I recommend or that get freed up in the individual. But it may turn out that the solution to the problem is more of a structural one rather than a behavioral one. And by that I mean perhaps somebody's in the wrong role. And it's not about trying to get them to adapt to the role. It's actually evaluating them again in the kind of cold light of reality and saying, what their strengths suggest that they belong in a different kind of role. Let's move them to another part of the organization or change the nature of their job. Or perhaps they're not working out at all and shouldn't even be in that organization. So that's what I mean by structural change.
Right.
So that's part of the assessment oftentimes.
You mentioned time. How long does this take? It probably is different for every company and organization, but I assume it takes many, many hours to evaluate the CEO, the board, and then come to some conclusions and speak to them. This sounds like a long process.
It's really less about solving problems in a kind of discrete sort of way, the way you just described it. This kind of thing happens in an ongoing way. You're constantly trying to solve problems of different sorts in the context of an ongoing advisory relationship. So it's not like, we start now and 2 months later the problem is solved and I'm finished.
So it's ongoing.
It's ongoing. Most of my advisory relationships with leaders tend to go on for the duration of their tenure as the leader, as opposed to some project-based approach.
Can you give us an example of a recent issue that you came across and helped the CEO become more resilient and made the company run smoother?
It's hard to give some examples without identifying the organization, which I don't want to do. But certainly in just a rather common kind of challenge over the last few years, this gets into a little bit of what's happening in today's world. Some of the biggest challenges over the last 2 years, and this may be stating the obvious, one is the adaptation to the COVID pandemic and the resulting shift to working remotely, which just has brought about a sea change in the way organizations work. And it's a change that I think is here to stay. To some degree, perhaps for our lifetimes. I don't see things
that way.
I don't think everything's ever going to revert back to a fully face-to-face world, and there are advantages to that and disadvantages. And then the other big challenge that is very much present in today's business and academic environment is the challenge that leaders face responding to some of the evolving and pressing political and social issues of the day, with increasing pressure on leaders to issue public statements, to appeal to different constituencies within their organizations, to speak to the outside world about things that in the past would have been well beyond the purview of the traditional CEO role. And so my clients and I wrestle with those kinds of issues all the time. And so to your point about resilience, which is an important concept, it's an inherently psychological one because it has to do with the ability to to respond to adversity in such a way that it doesn't get you down, but allows you to learn from adversity, to come back and find other solutions to problems that seem intractable, and to find the wherewithal internally, both at an individual as well as an organizational level, to deal with some hard challenges that could otherwise, bring an organization down, even in some cases.
Right. There's been, in the last few years with COVID and the other social upheavals that are going on, there's been some criticisms of certain company leaders that they're just kind of going along with a trend that they really don't believe in. Do you find that's the case, or they're committed to what they're saying publicly?
You're talking about the kind of political
Right. Are they
statements?
just trying to appease people, or do they really believe in what their company is supporting publicly?
It's so complicated. That's not a way of avoiding your question, but it's a true statement. It's really complicated.
Sure it is.
You have to ask a few kind of fundamental questions. Why is it that employees want their organizations and their leaders, the CEO in particular, to issue these kinds of public statements? Organizations that are in business to a financial firm or a manufacturing firm or an apparel company, it doesn't matter. They're in the business of those respective industries. They're not a public policy think tank. They're not a political party. And frankly, with the exception of perhaps a few really celebrity, high-profile CEOs, most of the outside world, outside of the organization, doesn't give a darn what the CEO of XYZ company thinks about war or one of the controversial social issues of the day. But
like DEI, for example. There are a lot of companies who've jumped on board the DEI, but there's talk that some of the leaders really don't believe in DEI, but they've had to go along with it.
Well, whether that's true or not, I mean, certainly most of the CEOs that I know feel very passionately about the value of diversity, defined in every sense of that word, racial and ethnic, but diversity of thought and other. And so most of the CEOs that I know, actually I think everyone that I work with, is passionate about the value of diversity in their organizations. But that may be different than what may be jumping on a DEI bandwagon in the way that it's practiced in some ways, which I think can be a bit more about signaling a certain kind of virtue than a program that actually moves the needle about the organization's diversity. Right. But that speaks to the pressure that these leaders are under to respond publicly, and sometimes it even feels like it's a lose-lose proposition when they do it, because they make a statement and they've pleased one group, but then they've made another group unhappy.
Right, made enemy on the side.
Exactly, and so none of this is easy, and the pressure is intense. And people inside organizations want to know that their leader, who they're emotionally connected to and following, feels the same way that they do sometimes, because it's very validating. And I think that's where some of this pressure derives from. But I think a lot of executives have learned the hard way that once you make one of these statements, it lives. And even in the face of new events and new understandings that might make you regret what you said in the heat of a moment. So I certainly urge a lot of caution. And I think that keeping one's eye on the beacon of what is the purpose of this organization. If an organization is there to make computers or to sell clothes, make really good computers or make really good clothes. Focus on that. You're in the business of being a business. And if people want to pursue their social conscience, by all means, they should be encouraged to do that, but not necessarily inside the organization where, with the best of intentions, it can create divisiveness and problems and distract from the mission. Keeping one's eyes on the mission of an organization, I think, is a probably good rule of thumb.
Right, that usually works well. I wanted to ask you about Ray Dalio. I read his book called Principles and his ideas for proper management and management style. He talks a lot about being brutally honest. And what do you think of Ray Dalio? He's a multi-billionaire, I think the head of the largest hedge fund on the planet.
Yeah,
It's very controversial.
it is
book.
controversial. I've read it as well. There are some things about it that I think have great merit, and some things that I think are really problematic. The idea of radical transparency, radical openness, is not as simple and straightforward as it sounds. Again, I'm at a distance from it. I don't have a close-up perspective on Bridgewater, his hedge fund that he founded, and obviously by the traditional measure of a hedge fund's success, which is making a lot of money, they've been extremely successful.
Right.
So one has to assume that if radical transparency is related to the idea of leaving no stone unturned when you're evaluating an investment and looking at everything, it's that perspective has undoubtedly contributed to, I've got to assume it's contributed to the success of that business.
Right.
But I think it goes a little too far in some ways because the idea of just giving people on the spot, unvarnished, even brutal feedback, which is also part of what I think that philosophy advocates, it has some unintended negative consequences. One, it is not mutually exclusive to be both candid but also sensitive and tactful. There is something to be said for timing,
Right.
because if I'm giving someone really tough feedback, I have to give it in a way that they're more likely to take it rather than giving it in a way that causes their defenses to go up, which actually causes them to shut down rather than to be receptive. Plus, as I understand it, that level of transparency and even recording conversations,
Right.
there is another basic human need that I think that neglects, which is a need for privacy, including in organizations. You talk about these, in some offices are all open plan these days. It's been the trend for quite a long time now, for a decade or two. And there's some real advantages to it in terms of to the extent that it fosters ease of collaboration and meeting people. But people still need to close a door sometimes and have a private conversation if you're giving feedback or discussing sensitive matters.
Right.
So both are useful, but so I'm just concerned that book has some great value, but also is extreme.
Right. Seems like he's gone to an extreme. I've read that after the book, and since then he's been in conflicts with multiple of his partners and associates. So I guess it doesn't work that well. Ray, you need to call Dr. Sulkowicz to clean things up at Bridgewater. How has technology affected what you do and influenced what you do and how you do it? Things are changing very rapidly in technology.
Profound impact in a number of ways. I mean, we were talking earlier in this conversation about the impact of the pandemic on the shift to a lot of remote work.
Right.
That's one huge area of impact, and personally, it's been advantageous to me. It's allowed me to work remotely, see people in different parts of the world, and cut down on the amount of travel that I do.
So you do a lot of Zoom communications.
I do a lot of Zoom. Yeah, I do a lot, and it's very effective. Although when I'm in town, I do try to see people in person because I do think that there's a lot to be said for reestablishing that connection in person. But
I think people might be more honest if you're in a room and in person than if you're on Zoom.
It's hard to generalize about that. I'm not sure that's entirely true. Some people find being on Zoom disinhibiting and actually speak more freely when they're not in the room. So it's funny that the birth of psychoanalysis. Freud wrote about the use of the traditional psychoanalytic couch. And in fact, this is what gave me some of my early ideas about this, which is that if you ask why in traditional psychoanalysis is the patient lying on the couch with the analyst sitting essentially behind the couch, out of the direct view of the patient?
Right.
And the reason is, at least Freud's explanation for using that technique.
So that was actually Freud's idea to do
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
I didn't know that. I thought that just evolved that way.
No.
Oh, that
It was a very specific idea. It wasn't just because it's relaxing to lie on a couch,
Right.
although that was part of it. But it was really because he felt that if the patient wasn't making direct eye contact with the analyst, it helped in a couple of ways. One is it freed the patient up to speak more freely because they weren't constantly monitoring the analyst's facial expressions and checking them for looking for signs of approval or disapproval or
Right,
that sort
reactions,
of thing.
right.
And it also was easier for the analyst behind the couch to not have to monitor his or her own reactions and to have a more what was referred to as a kind of evenly hovering attention.
That's interesting.
So because they were just listening, and not worrying about how they were sitting and whether or not
Right,
they
the psychoanalyst might think, wow, this guy's really crazy.
Yeah.
But
So there's some similarities to the use of remote technologies, even though it is video. But
right, face to face.
But the technology, aside from the remote aspect, which we could talk about for hours, other aspects of technology, so much is discussed about this these days. The influence of social media on culture and on people, in the sense that the use of social media is it's clear to me that it has such a really negative effect in a number of areas. One is it amplifies the extremes, because people tend to like the extremes, these pithy, nasty, inflammatory comments, and my friend Jonathan Haidt has written brilliantly about some of these topics, where he talks about how in amplifying the extremes, it contributes to a crowding out of the middle, where more reasoned, careful, thoughtful conversation can actually take place. And we all know that's something that is profoundly missing from society right now, when we are living in such a polarized world. He's also written a book recently about the impact of social media on the developing minds of children, in the sense that it promotes a lot of really terrible behavior in young kids. Shaming and bullying are much easier when if you're sitting face to face with somebody, you're more likely to get to know them as a human being. But if you're just if we're both some kind of anonymous figures, we don't have to even reveal our identities to other, you can say all kinds of garbage and get away with it. And it's terrible, actually. It's really bad for society and bad for kids.
Yeah, I interviewed your colleague, Jess Shatkin at NYU, who's a child psychiatrist, a few months ago, and we talked about the bad effects of social media. So, but it's continuing and spreading, so it seems like it's difficult to control.
It is difficult to control, although parents should basically prevent their kids from having cell phones until they're older.
What age?
I think there's no magic number, but the older the better. But my 15, 16, I would think would be the minimum. Yeah.
I see kids on the bus, 10 years old, 11 years old,
and
texting, going to websites.
It worries me.
Yeah, it is. It is very worrisome. What about AI? Do you think there will ever be an AI that can give advice to a CEO of a Fortune 500 company like you do?
Well, the like you do is the operative phrase in your question. Look, AI is the biggest technological development. It's all the rage. Everybody's talking about AI. A lot of people commenting on it. One of my favorite commentators who I spoken is a guy called Max Tegmark at MIT, who started a thing, I think it's called the Future of Life Institute, where they really are thinking deeply about the impact of AI on society, good and bad, and it's a nuanced perspective, so that it's not the savior for everything in this panacea, nor is it the sky is falling. But we do need to be thoughtful about the impact of AI. The holy grail in AI development, as I've been studying it myself recently, is AGI, artificial general intelligence, as they call it. And some say it's around the corner, or some say we were there in terms of having conversational interactions with AI. But it's a bit of a misnomer when people think of AI as achieving some kind of unity with human beings. It can do work a lot faster and grind a lot more data than human beings. So in that sense, it is smarter, based on one definition of smart. But I think it's worth asking the question: what is different between sophisticated AI and large language models and being human? One thing that AI doesn't do is have feelings.
Right.
It doesn't dream.
Emotions.
It doesn't dream. It doesn't have an imagination.
But it might develop that very soon.
Well,
It's just a matter of how many neurons we have connecting. We still have more neurons connecting than they've been able to put on NVIDIA chips. But I don't know. I think in a few years that may
we'll
be
see.
different.
We will see. I mean, some of my wonderful colleagues in the psychoanalytic world have done research into what is it in psychotherapy and the range of psychotherapies that are out there that is effective? What brings about helpful change in patients? People used to think, oh, my theory is superior to somebody else's theory. And in my view, and I think the research supports this, it's less about theoretical orientations in psychotherapy. And in some basic way, it's about sitting in a room, or perhaps on Zoom, with another warm-blooded human being who listens in an admittedly imperfect way, but a well-intentioned way, with some degree of warmth and empathy, and you work things out together. In other words, there's something about the relationship, and so you can have a wonderful, smart, sophisticated AI model that says things that may sound a little bit like, the analyst on the street corner, but it's not the same, because it's not a warm human being who's live and engaging in this shared intimate experience.
Right. It's difficult to define how our brains are different, but emotion is the cumulative connection of billions of neurons in microseconds, I think. And I don't know, AI may eventually achieve that, and I guess that's called consciousness.
I don't think so. I don't think that may be a technological model that approximates aspects of consciousness, but it's not the same thing. Because with consciousness, you also have the unconscious in humans,
Right.
which is the consciousness is sort of the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot more under the surface. That's the unconscious,
Right.
the product of our accumulated life experiences, our emotional lives, these parts of ourselves that may seem entirely irrational, but they drive us, they inform us, and that's not there in an AI model.
I guess we'll know when we're there when you have a robot at home, like Musk's robot, and it has an AGI brain, and it has conversations with you, and one day you ask the robot a question, and the robot says, "I'm not in the mood today."
We will see. We will see.
Right? That'll be the definitive way to show that the robot has emotions. "I'm not in the mood today. Don't talk to me about this. I'll get back to you tomorrow."
But some human will have had to have trained the model to say that. Is that really a mood?
Well, I don't know. How does a child develop those types of connections in their brain to have emotions and have a bad day and a good day? I'm not sure how. Nobody's been able to define that, but I think we're getting close to it. We'll see.
We learn from our environment
Right.
all the time, from the very beginning.
Right.
From the very beginning.
How do you determine if you've been successful helping a CEO or a board or a company? What's your definition of success?
That's not something I think about that much, to be honest with you. First of all, I'm much more interested in whether or not my client that I've been working with thinks that I've been successful,
Okay.
rather than my own judgment of that.
Right.
And sometimes I get that feedback. Sometimes you really see the impact of the work, which is very gratifying. You see a leader leading in a more effective way, or getting their team to function better, or changing the culture, and so it's very nice to see that kind of impact.
So the definition is not made by you, it's by your client. If your client
Yeah.
is happy with the results and they tell you, yeah, this is great, we want to see you again in a month or 3 months, that's a good sign.
Yeah, yeah. So, and these relationships tend to go on, as I said before, for extended periods of time for the tenure of the CEO, and you take things as they come. If for some reason things don't seem to be getting better, or if they're not getting what they need, I certainly would want to talk to them about that. But if it's not working, we would presumably stop. So in a sense, we're always constantly evaluating. You can't you don't evaluate it on the basis of, this meeting was a success and the next meeting wasn't. It doesn't work in such a linear way. But having an opportunity to talk in this deep way tends to be helpful to those who are willing to give it a try.
Right. Now you mentioned you have about 13, 15 people in your organization. Do they each have different areas of expertise? For example, if a CEO or a company contacts you and says, this is our problem, we need somebody to help us with this specific thing, might you say, oh, well, so-and-so in my group is really the expert on that?
To some degree, there's some specialization, although I'd say that all of us are also to a degree generalists. There are people in the Boswell group who focus almost exclusively on family businesses. Some focus a lot on educational institutions. Some focus on startups in the technology world, or in the startup community. But I think we all do. For me, one of the secret pleasures, not so secret.
It's not secret anymore.
Not anymore. One of the things that I love about my work, and I think my colleagues would probably agree with me on this, is that, and for me, it's one of the reasons why I don't specialize in any particular industry or type of organization, is because I get to basically be a student for the rest of my life. Because
you're learning on the job.
My clients are my best teachers.
Right. Learn something new every day. On that topic, what do you think are going to be your biggest challenges in the next few years, maybe 5 or 10 years, based on what's going on in our society and the economy and the world?
Of course, my crystal ball is cracked too, so it's hard to see the future. Some of the most challenging times that I have dealt with in the last 25 plus years of doing this are right now.
Right now.
Right now, the challenge of this pressure to talk about some of the external events that are having such an impact on society that that really transcend what these CEOs sort of thought they were there to do, perhaps, but now they have to grapple with things. They have to be so fluent in a far greater range of topics than a narrowly defined view of what has an impact on their business. They have to be fluent in geopolitics and social issues and contemporary trends and technology, AI, a lot of the things that we've touched on in this conversation. And they have to be effective public speakers. The level of scrutiny that CEOs are under is unprecedented, and which can be a good thing in the sense that if they take advantage of that level of scrutiny, they can use it to model the kind of behavior that they want to inculcate in their organizations culturally. But it's also really hard. It's tiring to know that you're never off duty as a leader. Every move is watched. Every word that comes out of your mouth is parsed for hidden or additional meaning.
Right.
So it's tough. It's a tough time to be a leader. But it's also exciting and gratifying, and to be able to have a positive impact on an organization is wonderful.
Right. I see it in my patients. I've been in practice for many years, and my patients are more and more stressed out in the last few years. And I see the anxiety. So part of my job has almost become to be a psychiatrist for them. There's a huge amount of stress there, and some people are not tolerating it well. That puts a lot of stress on you as well, right? If the clients you have are all stressed out and all these problems, they need more of your help. Do you ever have sleepless nights thinking that, wow, this is overwhelming. All of these people are counting on me to fix all sorts of problems. Very difficult.
Generally, I sleep pretty well. That's not to say that I don't have a sleepless night every now and then, and turns out I'm human too, and I'm not immune to some of the same.
So has the psychoanalysis training that you've had helped you deal with these issues?
It has helped me enormously. Not only the training, but being in analysis or in psychotherapy myself at different times in my life has been enormously helpful because we all need someone to talk to, and for me at different times to have someone to open up about problems that I'm dealing with that I don't have the answers to, which frankly happens on a daily basis, or some of the stress that I have unwittingly absorbed from my clients. It's very helpful, and it would seem unfair to burden my partner with all of that, although she's wonderful in being a sounding board to me. But I think the idea of having it's the same reason why my clients come to me. There's the reason why I find it helpful sometimes to talk to someone else.
Right. I want to go back to something you said right in the beginning about leadership and how leaders can cause people to do bad things. Why do you think that happens, and how does it happen? How does a bad person become the head of a country and cause chaos in that country and in other parts of the world? What's the psychology of that?
That's a big question. You got a few more hours?
Yeah, we got all night. Is there an answer?
There are. I think there are many answers. There's certainly not one pathway to a leader getting into a position of power and causing a lot of havoc. It happens in many ways. Some of the most problematic leaders throughout history have been severely narcissistic, not unlike some of the problematic, pathologically certain CEOs that I was describing earlier that I encounter when they're getting fired for having caused havoc in their companies and then having to be replaced. The combination of severe narcissism and political power and the opportunities that provides can be a really toxic brew. That's part of it. That's part of it. But also there's a psychoanalytic phenomenon called transference, which essentially has to do with projecting onto authority figures in the present aspects of one's past, either experiences with one's parents, or either difficult experiences with one's parents, or even wishes for how one wished one's parents would be. It's complicated. A lot of this happens totally outside of conscious awareness. And so sometimes when you have a really narcissistic, a pathologically narcissistic leader, they pull for all these kinds of projections and wishes, so that they're elevated to a position of power, and they're seen as a savior or somebody who people feel really understands them, even though in actual fact it's anything but that, and they're really out for themselves. But unfortunately, there's a great deal of susceptibility because people themselves are needy and stressed out. There's a susceptibility to investing these leaders with all sorts of power that they really shouldn't have, and unfortunately they exploit.
Right. Very interesting. Explains many things going on in the world. So this has been extremely educational and informative for me. I feel like I've also gotten some psychoanalysis and psychotherapy from you in the past hour. So I really appreciate you taking the time from your busy schedule to come and talk to us about this today.
It's a privilege to talk to you, and I really appreciate the invitation and your interest in my work.
All right, great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.